What's up everyone, it's Shaf, aka That Mill Guy, coming at you with a video that's been running through my head for a little bit now. It was originally kind of stuck in my head because some people in the Mill Discord introduced me to Corey's video on why he thinks that Modern, I'm talking about Squad Chief, why he thinks Modern is in a bad place. And I wanted to let it go. I went on this like couple of paragraph rant, and I really wanted to do, honestly, I wanted to put out a video today about why I think Rakdos Mill can't work and why and how I think it could. Let me know if you wanted to watch that video, by the way, comment section. But it was just further pushed by the Dive Down's recent episode on the unifying theory of what makes a good format. Link to both Corey's video and the Dive Down's episode down below. I wanted to offer my unique perspective as I play one archetype in multiple formats. Whereas the Dive Down and Corey, I believe to the best of my knowledge, are primarily modern players, but do dabble in other content, other formats here and there. But I play a lot of Historic, now more Standard, played a bit of Pioneer, dabbled in Legacy, very lightly sprinkled into Vintage, but with the same archetype. And I wanted to really talk about why I think Modern in general is technically in a weird place. It's in a place where there's a lot of positivity, but actually hidden below all of that, all of that gold and glitter, there actually is a bit of a dark underbelly. So before I kind of bury the lead too far here, I want to talk about how I come to that conclusion. So let's talk about really the side that the Dive Down took. And a lot of these points, both content creators touched on very well, but I think this final conclusion wasn't really fleshed out well. And that's what I want to offer in this video here. So the Dive Down talked about how Modern is very diverse right now. It's in an extremely diverse format. It's the most diverse it's ever been in a very long time. Through all the bannings, through all the crazy cards being printed in, especially for Modern Horizons. We're finally at a very cool place where if you look at the Modern League results, the Modern Challenge results, we have very diverse decks in the sense that we have decks from old Modern, such as Infect. We have decks from new Modern, such as the Uro-Piles. I mean, we have tap-out control decks, and we have decks with no lands. You can really play any deck and succeed with it. You can get those 5-0s, you can get those top placements in the Modern Challenges. So why is that really problematic? Well, you can slap together almost any list, play it sometimes budget, sometimes not budget. You can rent a lot of decks from mana traders. You can go through a lot. There's a lot of diversity to be had. There's a lot of people playing the format. Where do the problems come in? Well, going into what Corey was talking about, I think the big thing that I wanted to take away from his video was Modern is very consistent to the point of it being scary. Due to a couple of things, we're talking about power creep being primarily that factor, also allowing multiple decks to enable its plan very consistently due to the London Mulligan. So let's talk about the London Mulligan. That's the easy one. For Limited, this Mulligan rule was fantastic. Before, I believe we had what was called the Vancouver Mulligan, where you would mulligan down to the number of cards representing almost the number of times you mulligan. So if you kept your opening, you would have 7 cards. If you mulliganed once, you'd subtract that from 7, go to 6 cards, but you'd still scry 1. If you mulligan twice, you'd subtract that from 7, go to 5 cards. But now, with the idea that Wizards wants to remove a lot more non-games, they want to increase the consistency, allow people to play a lot more games of Magic. We have the idea of the London Mulligan allowing players to, as many of you know already, look at 7 cards each time they mulligan, allowing them to sculpt the most optimal hand every single game. One of Corey's examples that I think rung true for me was very simple. It was the concept that why wouldn't humans mulligan aggressively to that turn 1 Vial or that turn 1 Noble Hierarch? And I think that's very true. There's a lot of 2-drops in the archetype itself, so just having land Vial, land Noble Hierarch can get you to those 2-drops very consistently. You just drop that 3-drop in your hand. And with the power of some of these 2-drops especially, You can get there a lot of the times anyway, even with a turn to Thalia being able to stop the majority of deck, tempo them out. It's almost like you time walk them or whatever. In that case, the London Mulliganing has homogenized decks in the sense that everyone is allowed to do what they want. We will always have the turn 1 Hedron Crab. We will always have the turn 1 Thoughtseize, the turn 1 Monastery Swift Spear. And that level of consistency has led to a problem that I'm going to highlight after we talk about the concept of power creep, where everything these days cantrips. And I don't want to talk about the cards like Uro or Omnath. Y'all already heard those opinions. Y'all already have your own opinions about them. I actually want to highlight the concept of everything cantripping with the adventure mechanic, where, well, when you draw one of those cards, you have drawn 2 cards. They're 2 cards. Look at cards like Brazen Borrower and, well, Bone Crusher Giant. We're going to specifically focus in on Brazen Borrower here. When compared to Mill, we have something like Echoing Truth. Echoing Truth primarily is there to bounce Leyline of Sanctity or problematic Hexproof effects. That's really what it's been there for, and then it's been a catch-all. You can sometimes just bounce random creatures or whatever if they don't find the Leyline. You can get to it from there. The thing I really want to focus on here is the fact that it's bouncing 1 card. Very rarely will it be bouncing multiple cards. Sometimes you get the value of bouncing multiple creatures or multiple tokens, but it's bouncing 1 Leyline. So how different is that from Brazen Borrower? Oh yeah, if you counter the spell side of Brazen Borrower, you can't recast it. That's the same thing as countering Echoing Truth. The difference is that the high end is miles ahead. It's huge. The fact that once that card resolves, you have another card. You have drawn another card. You have a 3/1 body. You have a creature. You have interacted and now you have an offensive plan. You've been reactive, now you're proactive. Bone Crusher Giant. You have killed one of their creatures. Now you have a follow-up 3-drop on their end step. Kill their Noble Hierarch. Untap. Play a 3-drop. Consistency. As with the London Mulligan, consistency is what Wizards has been trying to push, homogenizing the fact that decks are now allowed to do whatever they want because they just have everything. All of their cards do everything. Look at Death and Taxes, having the new Apparition card. That card itself is... Look, the fact that it comes onto the battlefield and completely removes a permanent forever steps up above cards like Oblivion Ring. You won't get that card back, you're just gonna get an illusion. Imagine that coming down, taking out your Tarmogoyf. You will never get that 5/6 that you have back for 2 mana, you're just gonna get a 2/2. That's the problem with this card. Consistency and the ability to get cards like this through the London Mulligan and having opening hands that allow you to tempo out your opponent to then draw into these cards is what Modern is suffering from currently. All of this leads to the idea that the answers are a lot worse. Now, you might be thinking, the London Mulligan proliferates the idea that you will always, or more consistently, find your sideboard cards. But I would argue that's not actually that great, because the sideboard cards themselves aren't actually, completely shutting out certain strategies. You'll just find them more often. If you look at the concept of multiple cards or drawing through, that consistency is also a problem because those sideboard cards, those answers, are significantly weaker than the threats they are trying to answer. Look at something like Assassin's Trophy now being significantly worse than something like Cryptic Command. Whereas Cryptic Command, you would always need to be reactive, your opponent could play a powerful threat or multiple threats, and you would beat it. Now, that is the de facto answer, because when a card like Uro comes down, when a card like Apparition comes down, Assassin's Trophy is almost useless because the card has already had its effect. How deflated do you feel when you go to Assassin's Trophy in Uro when it's already ramped, drawn a card, gain life? What's the point? Oh, you path to exiled it, ramped, gained some life, drew a card, and I get a land out of it now. I don't even care. Rest in peace. Is barely affecting these decks because they're able to do anything and everything. They're able to draw into their alternate plans. What does Rest in Peace do against an Uro deck? Oh, it shuts off Mystic Sanctuary. So what? They bounce it with Cryptic Command. So what? They play Uro. So what? They play, Big Teferi and win that way. There are multiple ways to win with these strategies, and that's the problem. The consistency, the power creep in these cards doesn't line up with the answers. Two formats to compare to. Standard. In Standard, you have a very small card pool, but right now through the bannings, I would argue that, and many people tend to mirror this right now, Standard's as diverse as it's ever been. You can play multiple different strategies, from red aggressive strategies to Dimir rogues to control and whatever. You can do a majority of things and really get there with almost anything because the answers line up with the threats. We don't have Omnath anymore. We don't have Uro anymore. We don't have these cards that are doing 50 different things all at once. And now, one-for-oneing becomes even better. And now that you actually have threats that do powerful things, sure, when threats enter the battlefield, they do things. When they attack, they do things. The problem is they don't have game-winning effects. You can actually just answer them with removal. You can answer them by playing a mythic and outpowering the rare. Whereas now, the uncommon outpowers the mythic. Look at Cleansing Wildfire. Look at what that card's doing to Pauper right now. That card outweighs rares that are played in Modern right now. Look at Legacy, as I was mentioning. A format where the diversity is also similar to Modern, but Modern does it worse. Legacy's diversity comes down to blue decks, non-blue decks. The blue decks help police the power of the non-blue decks, but even the blue decks have their unfair concepts. Force of Will handles the unfairness that decks like Reanimator can get around to. But the answers in Legacy provide that interesting back and forth. Look at the cards that Reanimator can play, such as Chancellor of the Annex, and how that actually stops that turn 1 Force of Will. Because now that Force of Will isn't free anymore, you can actually just go off on turn 1 relatively safely, forcing your opponent to have multiple counterspells. The back and forth is actually interesting. The counterplay is actually on flavor with the plan. You don't need to go out of your way to play them. Whereas Modern is so damn diverse that you do not have enough sideboard slots to encompass everything. Whereas something in Legacy like Leyline of the Void can actually come in against multiple matchups like Reanimator, Lands, Black-Green Depths. Leyline of the Void hits all three of those strategies pretty well, those tier 1 archetypes. Whereas, look at how many tier 1 decks there are. Would you actually play some type of board wipe against maybe something like Taxes and Humans? Sometimes you might not even get that off against Taxes. So sometimes you feel like you should be playing more point removal because Taxes doesn't really go wide. It 1s-for-1, whereas Humans goes wide, so you want a board wipe. Sometimes they just get away with it. So it's very weird. And then, like, do you bring in the same cards that you bring in against Oops All Spells and Modern ad nauseum? No, you don't have enough sideboard slots. So the problem is the main board needs to have enough answers. That is where Modern's problem lies. The answers do not line up with the threats like they do in healthy formats like current Standard, like, I don't know. Legacy's healthiness is arguable, but the power, it's been relatively consistent, right? It doesn't line up like those formats. And that is where the problem lies. The consistency has made it so you can do whatever you want, you can get your plan going, so it's all about just having the best plan. And that'll just end up being the most consistent plan. And there's no way to stop it. And I don't ultimately know what the best answers are to print to beat some of these threats, but I think that is where a lot of these players like Corey have problems with Modern right now. It's very difficult because it's just the homogeneity, it's just so hard to answer. Like he was saying, it feels like every game plays out the same way. Everyone's allowed to do whatever they want, and it's just, are you going to be stronger when your opponent is allowed to do what they want versus when you're allowed to do what you want? The interaction it just feels so minuscule because once you interact with them, it feels like your interactive answers just aren't powerful enough because they're just going to do what they want again, or they just have the ways to recover. So ultimately, I'm going to leave this up to you. How do you feel about Modern right now? Do you think that, again, it's the best it's ever been? Like I was saying in the beginning of the video, super diverse, you can do whatever you want. You're happy that archetypes that you usually didn't see the light of day, like Mill, are now able to be up there, be represented due to consistency and printing? Or do you agree with some of the more enfranchised players like Squad Chief that highlight the fact that answers aren't lining up with the consistency? Or actually, Squad wasn't really talking about that. I'm kind of just going off of what he's saying. But yeah, answers aren't lining up with threats. And the consistency just makes the threats that much better. So why not allow the consistency to help these sideboard cards be better? I don't know. If you wanted to see, well, more thoughts like this, if you wanted to see me do more videos like this, then the Patreon is the best place to join. I got these ideas from talking to a couple individuals there, and they kind of promoted the idea of pushing the idea out there. So I wanted to talk about it. And well, if you wanted to catch my content early as well and get those exclusives, that's exactly where you want to be. But I'm done rambling here. I'm going to leave the video off there. Again, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Remember that even the impossible is possible, and as we ponder that thought, I hope you'll join me next time as we take a glimpse into the unthinkable.